if you could just talk to me, just you can say anything, and I'll just check your level into the computer for the audio.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Rhubarb, rhubarb, rhubarb.
Rhubarb, rhubarb, rhubarb. That's brilliant.
We're very fortunate to be joined today by Lord Sumption, who will be speaking to my colleague Matt Gibson about where we are with coronavirus in society. Lord Sumption has been vocal in his views against lockdown, which he has described as thoroughly inhumane and taking us towards a totalitarian state. A former Oxford History Fellow before turning to the legal profession, he has written and lectured widely on the judiciary in society, as he titles it, The Limits of the Law. My colleague Matt will be speaking to him now.
Morning, Lord Sumption.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time. And I think Lucy sent you the questions yesterday, so it'll give you a rough idea of hopefully the theme we're hoping to go along.
Yes.
Does that?
Well, there are questions I've been asked quite often before.
That was what I thought. I did have obviously look at what you'd said before, and I just thought it would be quite helpful to elaborate on some of them now, given the time in, and see where we go, really. I don't think there'll be anything that will necessarily catch you up, but I think it's your view that people want to hear. So, Dan, are we ready to go? The podcast feels it's coming at a very appropriate time in some ways. Obviously, this week, MPs are voting to extend the Coronavirus Act, the emergency laws we've been living under since March last year. The indications are there's a few exceptions, but I suspect it's highly likely it will pass without any particular difficulty. It takes me back to something you said last year when you said about the role of politicians. If we hold politicians responsible for everything that goes wrong, they will take away our liberty so that nothing can go wrong. They will do this not for our protection against risk, but for their own protection against criticism. Do you feel that with the vote this week, MPs will be voting for our protection as society, or is there an element of voting for their own protection?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between the government front bench and the rest of the House of Commons. I think that MPs will vote out of a mixture of feelings about what they think are the public interests, a subject on which they, of course, differ, and party loyalty. We don't know what a free vote would produce. I suspect that it would also produce an extension of the regulations. People are frightened. They're frightened partly because the government has frightened them, but that's the present situation. And they want action without caring all that much whether the action works or whether it produces collateral consequences that may be much worse than the disease. We also have an opposition which has declined to work as an opposition. Basically, what the Labour Party has done is to take government policies and double them.
I think it's an interesting point about the opposition, actually, because one thing that I think many of the critics of lockdown have long made is there's been very little official opposition, so to speak, against the measures. As you say, the opposition more or less has voted through what the government has said, which seems personally slightly extraordinary given the magnitude of the measures. Other opposition has tended to come, perhaps to a small degree, from the media, and to a large degree from people like yourselves who've been willing to speak out, and I suspect at perhaps some personal cost. How do you feel about this, the fact that it has been so hard perhaps to oppose and get voices heard against these measures?
Well, in a sense, that's the reason why I have been speaking out. I would have much preferred somebody other than a prominent ex-judge to be making these points. There are lots of people who agree with them who will not put their head above the parapet. I know that because from the very moment when I started making these points, I began to get emails from politicians members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, who agreed with what I had to say, but who said that they themselves didn't dare to speak out. That, I think, is a very serious state of affairs. We are living in a society which has become incredibly tolerant of dissent on any issue on which people feel fear.
So what do you think it is that's stopping people from speaking out? What is it that's limiting backbench MPs? Some backbench MPs have, of course, spoken out, but I think at the last vote it was 16 or 17.
It has been larger at earlier times.
Right. Okay. But what do you think it is that's stopping not just MPs, but perhaps even certainly the wider scientific community? I think there's many who've got views who've expressed to Lucy, I know, but they don't feel able to put their names to in the press. I feel there is a culture perhaps where people aren't able to say what they truly think.
Well, in the case of the scientists, there's no doubt that some of them have been subject to an extraordinarily unpleasant campaign of personal abuse. Which in at least one case that I know of has extended to their families. That I think is absolutely disgraceful. It is unfortunately the mood into which we are moving. There is a feeling that, to use the hackneyed phrase, if we're all in it together, it's outrageous, antisocial and treasonable to express a dissenting view. But the fact is we aren't all in this together. We're not all in it together because we have different views, we have different vulnerabilities, and we are a democracy in which people ought to be entitled to voice their differences.
Sure. And I suppose it takes me on, actually, given that we are in a situation where these laws exist. Perhaps there's a strong argument that these laws and measures haven't been challenged in a democratic way as perhaps they might, or perhaps ought to be demanded they should be. So back to a recent comment you made, which caused some surprise as a retired Supreme Court judge, but when you said the most public-spirited thing you can do with despotic laws is ignore them. And I just wondered if I could ask you to elaborate slightly on that point. Are there particular laws you had in mind? Was it meant to be taken literally, or was it more a representation of as I say, where we are in the frustration of it?
Well, I was speaking generally, but of course in the context of the lockdown, which is the most intrusive set of laws curtailing basic human activities that we have, I think, ever endured, even in wartime. I've never believed there is a moral obligation to obey the law. Of course, there is a legal obligation to obey the law, and people whose conscience makes them feel that they should not obey it must accept that if they get caught and prosecuted, they will be punished. They can't complain about that. But ultimately, whether you are going to run that risk is a matter for every individual in his own conscience.
And I think we've seen an illustration of that in the last couple of weeks with the protests at Sarah Everard to start with. Last night, in fact, in Bristol, which is obviously against the police and crime bill rather than lockdown per se. Although there has been a suggestion that a lot of these protests have been perhaps an outlet in some ways caused by the lockdown and the stress. It wouldn't be for me to say what the thinking behind these protesters was, but that has certainly been mooted. But people are prepared to break these laws because they feel that there's no other way.
Yes, I mean, I think that it was very unfortunate that the current Home Secretary removed, and I think it was pretty clearly her work, she had removed from the earlier versions of the regulations an exception for protests by people who were prepared to lodge a protocol with the authorities to determine distancing and safety in the course of the protest. And I don't think there's much doubt that the reason why she did that was that she wanted to suppress protests against, for example, climate change in particular, and I think also protests against the lockdowns. The fact is that the police were extraordinarily brutal in breaking up the Sarah Everard demonstration on Clapham Common last week, but no more brutal than they had been on the 26th of September, when they broke up with considerable violence a demonstration which had been perfectly peaceful in Trafalgar Square against the lockdown. Some 20 people were hospitalized on that occasion, and quite a significant number were arrested. Now, there was no violence on that occasion either. The police claimed that people were not distancing enough. I have to say that if the only way that you can enforce social distancing is by beating people over the head with truncheons, it's not worth it.
No, absolutely. I'm sure you'd find plenty of agreement there. And you mentioned the moral obligations of the law, and I think that's quite an interesting point, actually, because I think one of the points you've made is quite often where the moral side of the law comes in. It's something that ought to be dealt with in a democracy by Parliament and elected individuals, perhaps more than the judiciary. I think it's to sum up very crudely, I think. And one of the themes you've said in your legal lectures about perhaps the judiciary not becoming involved in political issues. I think you suggested political questions are not apt for the judiciary. I think perhaps we've seen, or certainly it's been levelled, that during this crisis, policy has been dictated and driven by scientists and SAGE in particular. And so I wondered if I could just turn that around and ask whether you believe that political questions are apt for scientists.
Well, scientists are in a position to give advice to the government on what the clinical consequences of different measures may be. They are not qualified to give advice to government on how they should balance that against other considerations which are not scientific at all. The problem that governments face, although they have shied away from meeting their responsibilities on this, is that this is not just a public health issue. Saving lives is not the only thing that matters. It's not just a public health issue because it is also a really critical economic issue. It's an educational issue and it's a moral issue. Now, the decision about how much weight to give to advice about saving lives and how much weight to give to having an economy in which there are jobs for young people, that is essentially a political decision. In his evidence to the House of Commons some months ago, Chris Whitty, accompanied by Sir Patrick Vallance, said, well, he accepted that the measures taken to contain the virus had been destructive. Well, indeed they have. But when pressed, he said that it wasn't basically his function to think about that. Well, I accept maybe it wasn't his function, but somebody has got to think about the problem in the round. And whenever the government says, we will be guided by the science, they are essentially betraying their essential function. They are looking at only one side of a complex problem instead of the whole of it. And in the course of doing so, they are visiting immense destruction on our society. That is something which is, to my mind, a betrayal of the function for which any government exists, which is to look not just at the science, but at the whole picture.
This is probably too straightforward a question in many ways, but what would you suggest could be done to perhaps have more equilibrium in terms of the decisions that Parliament is making? Is there a simple...
Well, I think there are a number of factors. One is that the government should stop using the provision of information as a way of manipulating opinion and behavior. They have consistently tried to pretend that this is a virus which is indiscriminate, when it is perfectly well established and has been from the outset, that it primarily affects people with identifiable vulnerabilities, often but not invariably attributed to advanced age. That's one essential point. The other is that it is very dangerous for governments to take scientific advice or advice on any subject, in fact, from a closed group of people whose involvement in the decisions commits them to a particular point of view. There is a problem about this, which is well understood by political psychologists. If you are involved in making a drastic decision, it's pretty well impossible for you to change your mind, because as the problems mount up, it's very difficult for people to admit that all the hardship that they inflicted in the past was a waste because it was a mistake. What this means is that if you take advice from a closed group of scientists, you are simply going to get them repeating the same thing. You never have a fresh look at the evidence. And I think that governments should take advice on the basis that they listen to alternative views and weigh them up. This is not a subject on which scientists are all agreed. The scientists at SAGE may all be agreed, but the scientific world contains very many entirely reputable experts who think that the current way of approaching COVID-19 is a scientific and a health disaster. Remember that before the lockdown was ordered, every country in the world of which I'm aware, which had published a pandemic plan, had rejected the idea of lockdowns, had rejected the idea of coercion, and had rejected the idea of indiscriminate measures instead of having targeted measures directed at the most vulnerable. Now, that was the view of the scientific community. What caused them to change this? The answer is it was politics. It was politics because what happened was that public pressure grew up in March of last year that if Italy, if France and Spain were locking people down, then why weren't our government doing the same? So that pretty well simultaneously, within a period of about 4 to 5 weeks, every European country jettisoned the very careful plans that most of them had prepared over the previous decade for exactly this event. And there wasn't time, there wasn't the research available to decide what the consequences of doing that were. They did it for political reasons. There is no trace in the SAGE minutes of SAGE having recommended a lockdown before the 23rd of March when the Prime Minister announced one.
So why do you feel that political position was reached? I think you mentioned public pressure, and I think perhaps that's been something that's occurred throughout. We've done polls, we've all seen the polls where it would appear that public are largely in favour of lockdown when asked. I've been responsible for polls, actually expecting perhaps if something's worded in a different way, you might get a different answer. I have to say that does appear to be the public position. It's been suggested to us a lot of this is driven by the fear of the virus that's been generated by the politicians, by SAGE. And I suppose in some ways one could argue it becomes a cyclical argument because the more fearful the public is, the more measures they want the politicians to take, and then it feeds itself. But I wonder, why do you think that public pressure where did it come from, and how can it go away, more importantly, I suppose?
I don't think that the government is entirely responsible for generating the fear. I think that the craving for security, if necessary at the expense of liberty, is a tendency which human societies have had for a very long time, and certainly democracies have shown an increasing tendency to go for security at all costs for many years. So this isn't entirely new, but it's not irresistible. And politicians with stature and courage can stand up to it. They can reason with people. I think that we do not find, at the moment, the policy taken, the very different policies pursued by the Swedish government have been controversial both in Sweden and elsewhere. The polls in Sweden suggest that people are roughly divided down the middle about it. But what has happened in Sweden is that there has not been the overwhelming support for abrasive and intrusive measures that we have seen here, essentially because the government and the health authorities have engaged in a reasoned discussion with the public. They haven't treated them like children. The situation in this country is very different. We have had politicians who lack the moral and political stature to stand up for the public interest in the face of often unreasoning public pressure. On the contrary, they have done their best to fan the fears. And there's no doubt that this has been a deliberate policy. The behavioral scientists on SAGE wrote a very interesting paper in March, very shortly before the lockdown was announced. And what they said was that the essential thing is that we mustn't allow people to get the idea that they are less vulnerable than others. For example, some people might think that the young and healthy are not at very great risk. Now, that statement is true. They're not at very great risk. But, said this particular SAGE paper, we must dispel that idea. We must make them feel afraid because otherwise we're not going to get compliance. And that is what has happened. We have phrases like this terrible virus, it's a terrible virus for people with underlying and identifiable vulnerabilities. It's not a terrible virus for the great majority. We have had statements designed to suggest that the virus is totally indiscriminate in its effect. This is completely untrue, but there's no doubt that people have been influenced by it. And it's not the only factor, but it's undoubtedly one significant factor in the degree of public support that it has had. The other factor, of course, is the unwillingness of people to look beyond the immediate issue. The immediate issue is obviously health and deaths, but the bigger issue further down the road is what happens to our society when we stop educating our children. What happens to our society when we endure a 10% reduction in GDP, the worst in 300 years? The answer is that what happens is that young people, themselves almost entirely unaffected by the health risks, young people are being thrown onto a job market where there are no openings for them. We are seeing a world in which people with great talent, with degrees in engineering or trained musicians, are stacking shelves in supermarkets and driving delivery vans. And they're doing that because there are no job opportunities. This is the world that we have created.
I was going to ask you about the decline of democracy being mundane and insidious, you once said, but it strikes me perhaps this has gone a little further down the path than mundane and insidious and is probably staring us in the face. Is that
I think that democracies are clearly constitutionally and legally entitled to engage in mass coercion against their fellow citizens. And this is what has happened. But I think the difficulty is that democracies which behave like that rapidly cease to be political communities in any meaningful sense. And that is the stage at which they cease to be democracies. Democracy can only exist within a political community, and you destroy political communities by engaging in mass coercion. There are very few historic exceptions to that.
And finally, and I do appreciate your time and thank you so much for joining us today, but one last question, and it is a general one, I hope not too much so, and it's what should we do? What should we do as a society, and what would you like government to do if there was one thing to each, if you like?
I think it's politically unrealistic to expect the government to backtrack now. They've invested too much of themselves in it. So, although the ideal would be to revert to a voluntary system, which was what the authorities all recommended before last March, I don't think that is going to happen. And I have to say that I'm extremely pessimistic about this. An interesting parallel is the continuation of wartime food rationing after the last war. People were in favor of that because they were in favor of social control. They'd had a lot of it during the war. They thought that this was an answer. In the 1950 and 51 general elections, the Labour Party lost its majority entirely because people with 5 years more experience of social control got fed up with it. Sooner or later, that will happen in this country.
But you think it could be that kind of timescale?
I think it may be even longer.
That's alarming, I suspect. Thank you so much for your time. Was there anything else you'd like to cover, or do you think we've?
I've tried to answer your questions.
No, you've been extremely helpful, and I'm sorry to go slightly off piece with some of them. It was just I felt that some of the answers you gave.
I don't mind. I'm a great believer in off-piste skiing.
Oh, excellent. Well, no, it was fascinating for me. I suspect, as you say, you've given many of those answers before, but I think it's really useful to expand on it. It's helpful for us to understand it more, and it will be helpful to get a podcast out, which I've just been told by Lucy, as soon as it's been edited and produced by Dan, we'll of course send it to you for your approval before we do anything else with it.
Okay.
But thank you so much for your time, Lord Sumption. I really appreciate it, and I hope to speak again soon.